Welcome to another Flip video. This is for chapter 6.2, video B. Today we're going to be talking about reform of the Gilded Age, the progressive movement. As a reminder, the Gilded Age was all about how our country looked like it was doing really good. There were a lot of wealthy people, industry was exploding, and lots of people were moving in. However, there was a lot of problems underneath the surface that these rich people and the way economics were changing made everything seem like it was okay, but working conditions were terrible. Only a handful of people were rich, a lot of people were underpaid and were poor. So the progressive movement was a way to fix these problems. And progressive movement roughly estimated between 1900 to 1920. Now this was a response to the Gilded Age. And it started mainly as a social movement, as a way to, protests with speeches, looking at how the common man can cure things and fix things, but it grew into more of a political movement. People felt that the best way to fight this greed and corruption that was seen was, one, good education for people. Make people know really what it is that a good life should be. Make them aware, teach them to read, to write. A safe environment, whether it's at home or at work. And that's going to come back later here, the safe environment idea. Next was an efficient workplace. And to have an efficient workplace, it needed to be safe, obviously. Now, progressives believed that government could be a tool for change. As of right now, government was in some ways a tool to allow the Gilded Age to continue, as government officials, at least in some cases, were taking bribes. They were allowing people to continue being corrupt and filled with greed. During this time as well, 4 amendments were added to our Constitution. One allowed women to vote, one was for prohibition, a third was an income tax, a tax on people's income, and a fourth allowed the common person, the common citizen, to vote for their U.S. senator, as opposed to allowing the legislatures to do it, which is what they used to do. This is a great comic here on the progressive movement and having Theodore Roosevelt, stopping the lumber trust companies and saying, whoa, that's too much lumber. As you'll learn later in history in your career, Theodore Roosevelt felt businesses and corporations were okay, but that they had to be regulated by the government. Let's talk about prohibition, which was the 18th Amendment. It lasted from 1920 to 1933. Now, prohibition did not allow the manufacturing, selling, and transporting, which included import and export, of alcoholic beverages. In 1914, which is about 6 years before the federal amendment, Washington passed a law that did not allow the manufacturing or sale of liquor. Now, it didn't say you couldn't consume it, you just couldn't sell it or make it. How does that work? Now, with this prohibition came bootleggers. Bootleggers would bring in illegal alcohol from Canada. Now, unfortunately, the Coast Guard was unable at first to stop these bootleggers coming in from Canada up in our area in the Northwest. However, they were properly funded, so they were able to stop these bootleggers. People still wanted their alcohol, and they were finding ways of doing this. One of the most successful bootleggers was actually a man from Seattle. He was a police officer, Lieutenant Olmsted. In fact, he was so successful that he was making $200,000 a month. You heard me, a month. Whoa. Let's talk about some causes of prohibition. Well, and here's a good example in Washington State anyways. In 1879, Washington Territory banned the sale of alcohol within 1 mile of construction of the Northern Pacific Railroad. They were afraid that saloons would take advantage of workers when they got off work, much like how saloons took advantage of the Native Americans by taking all their money, giving them alcohol, and then becoming drunks and become addicted to the liquid. In fact, people viewed saloons, and I quote this from a source I read online, as an instrument of Satan's work among God's unfortunate creature. A huge push, which allowed prohibition to go into effect was women's suffrage movements. They viewed alcohol as this great evil in the home. Take a moment, pause the video please, and I'd like you to read through this poster. It shows a great view of prohibition and why women maybe didn't necessarily like alcohol in the home. Now, to go with reform of businesses, there was also political reform going on. Progressives wanted to stop political machines and the spoils system politics. Now, spoils system, if you remember from learning about Andrew Jackson, was the idea of rewarding people who helped you and voted for you with government jobs. So this could definitely be take advantage of if you think about it, especially coupled with political machines, people who worked with private industry to kind of rub backs and to help each other out. An example in Washington State, how progressives stopped political machines and spoil systems, was the Municipal League of Seattle, which was created to fight political machines and spoil system. They did this through having independent evaluations of potential government officials. So before these guys were voted for, they checked out their backgrounds to make sure that, it was okay for them to run for office. They also championed different reforms, such as public ownership of mass transportation, like, buses and whatnot. Everyone should have the right to get from point A to point B with now some company having a monopoly and, charging people $5 to go 1 mile when maybe it should cost, $1. They also pushed for public ownership of utilities, such as water and electricity. So really they felt basic necessities should be run by the government or public groups, not private individuals. A former governor of Washington State by the name of John Rogers was another huge progressive and a man who pushed for political reform. Some of his promises, first off, was a push for public education. In fact, it became a law called the Barefoot Schoolboy Law, which allowed tax money on private property to help fund public education. He also pushed for economic regulation, which allowed the government to kind of have a say on how people were running their private businesses so people wouldn't take advantage and have monopolies. He also pushed for women's suffrage, allowing women the right to vote. Now, there are some very specific political reforms that we need to talk about that occurred during this time, and that's still in place in Washington State. First off, we have something called initiatives. Initiatives allow citizens to propose laws through gathering signatures on a petition. Think Walmart, guys. I'm sure you've seen them collecting signatures. And once these people have enough signatures, then these laws are put on a ballot and citizens can vote on these laws. The very first initiative was prohibition. Referendums allow citizens to vote for or against laws that state lawmakers have already passed. Here's an interesting fact. From 1914 to 2012, there have been 74 proposed referendums. However, only 37 of them have been sent out. Interesting. In 1924, an example of a referendum was there was a prohibition of butter substitutes. It's Referendum 16. Now this law was overturned. And this is why. Because the law said at the time you were not allowed to sell butter that contained vegetable fat or non-pure milk substitutes. Who knew? If you look online, you can see more referendums that have come across Washington State ballots. Very interesting. Finally, there was a recall, which allowed citizens to remove elected officials who were not doing the job the way they should have. Kind of like Hiram Gill. And people got rid of him because of his attitude toward gambling and other vices, which he allowed to run rampant. And women, again, were a huge push in getting Hiram Gill out of office. In fact, they were able to do that just after they were given the right to vote. I made a comment that I already talked about reform of business, but I hadn't. That was about prohibition. I apologize. Let's now talk about how businesses were reformed. First off, progressives wanted to limit the power of companies. such as railroad companies and the utility companies, people who were in charge of water and electricity. And these were the worst of the offenders when it came to big private businesses. See, progressives didn't like how these companies had monopolies. And when they had a monopoly, they could control prices and they could pretty much get rid of small companies because they couldn't compete. So once the small companies were gone, then these big companies had a monopoly and they could slowly raise prices. A great example of how business was reformed can be seen in Seattle's port. So a little background on it. First off, through various means, James Hill, or J.J. Hill, ended up owning most of Seattle's harbor. Because remember, Seattle wanted a transcontinental railroad, and they were actually giving land away to railroad companies. Well, in 1889, the Washington Constitution said no more. Governments could not give gifts of land to the railroads. So that stopped Hill and other people like him from gaining land, specifically around the harbor. People now wanted to connect Lake Washington to the Puget Sound via Lake Union. So in case you can't picture that in your head, here's Lake Washington, here's the city of Seattle, here's Lake Union, here's the Puget Sound. This is a huge lake, guys, and if you're able to get ships to go here, that's massive amount of shipping you can do. Well, James Hill had a monopoly. He owned a lot of the land right here, which meant that he can control transportation. So if you're able to get shipping lanes through here, well, you bypass James Hill's monopoly because James Hill didn't necessarily own this land. Well, through various means, election was put forth which created port commissioners who would run the harbors for public interest. And the elected commissioners would run this port. Hence, slowly they bought land back, and they got the land back from Hill. So no more was it private individuals owning harbor lands. It was a company, a group of people who were elected. Finally, we have some lasting progressive successes or achievements. First off, you had women's suffrage groups led by people like May Arkwright Hutton, who helped to get women the right to vote. In fact, Washington state got women the right to vote 10 years before the federal government. Another huge achievement was that workdays were shortened to 8 hours. Finally, child labor in mines was banned, and it was law that children had to go to school. Thank you for sticking with this flip video. It was a little longer, a lot to talk about with the progressive movement. Check out Emoto for the questions. Thank you.